Well, good evening. I'm Graham Allison, Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and it's my honor to serve as the moderator for tonight's forum on the legacy of Sam Huntington. We're especially pleased that Sam's wife, Nancy, who worked for many years here at the Kennedy School, and Tim are here tonight with us. So, Nancy, thank you very much. Archibald MacLeish once observed that when one thinks of the greatness of Harvard, one thinks first of the dead. And that observation was never more apt than in the realms in which Sam Huntington was a leading thinker. Like many in the audience tonight, I count myself a student of Sam's, though I never was fortunate enough to take a course from him. I read his books, The Soldier and the State, The Common Defense, Political Order in Changing Societies, The Clash of Civilizations, Challenges to American National Interests. Over a career of more than almost 5 decades here at Harvard, Sam published 17 books and hundreds of articles. He had the rarest of capacities, especially among political scientists, but I would say in general among the professoriate, the rarest of capacities for penetrating insights. He had a scholar's commitment to facts and a prodigious capacity to assemble and analyze the widest array of evidence. But what distinguished him most from others in the fields in which he thought was his capacity for uncovering original insights about dynamics and their consequences. Sam's intellectual legacy remains vivid in these books and articles, which are available to read and make good reading, I would say. But for anyone who follows academic or policy debates in international relations, or national security policy, or economic and political development, or civil-military relations, Sam's legacy is also vibrant in the current thinking of his students, 4 of whom constitute our panel tonight. Leading off will be Fareed Zakaria, a PhD from Harvard's Government Department in 1993. Fareed's publications include The Future of Freedom and most recently, The Post-American World. In his latest incarnation, Fareed is demonstrating that it's possible to bring a serious and subtle mind to the medium of television in his CNN flagship international affairs program, Fareed Zakaria GPS. Fareed will be followed by Elliott Cohen. Elliott is a PhD from Harvard's Government Department in 1982. Elliott's currently the Osgood Professor of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins. He served as counselor in the Department of State in the second term of the Bush administration when Condi Rice, who will be here in the forum at 8 o'clock tonight, was the secretary. Elliott's publications extend Huntington insights from his Commandos and Politicians to his most recent Supreme Command, Soldiers, Statesmen, and Leadership in Wartime, which won the Huntington Prize administered by the John Olin Institute of Strategic Studies here at Harvard. Elliott will be followed by another of Sam's star PhD students, Frank Fukuyama. Frank received his PhD in the Gov Department in 1981. For many years, he was a professor at the Nitze School at Johns Hopkins, but has just moved recently to Stanford. And among Frank's publications is probably the first or second, depending on how you compete with Clash of Civilizations, most important book written in these fields in the period since the end of the Cold War, The End of History and The Last Man. Our cleanup hitter is Gideon Rose, a PhD from the Gov Department in 1994. After 10 years as the managing director at Foreign Affairs, Gideon has just become its editor-in-chief. Gideon's recent published How Wars End, A History of American Intervention from World War I to Afghanistan, began as his doctoral thesis here at Harvard some years ago. So I'm also pleased to announce tonight that thanks to the leadership of 2 great Harvard supporters, great admirers of Sam Huntington, Peter Malkin and Henry Rosofsky, a Huntington Fellowship Fund has been created, which will, in the future, support graduate students who will follow, we hope, in the footsteps of the 4 members of our panel tonight. So that's very fitting, and we thank you for your leadership in that regard. Let me turn to Fareed.
Graham, thank you so much. It's a huge honor to be here, an honor to in any way be able to commemorate and remember Sam. It's a little daunting to have to do it in front of Nancy, his widow, and Joe Nye, one of those people who I describe as one of my professors, though like you with Sam, Graham, I never actually took a course with Joe, but attended so many seminars that I feel as though I got the best of both worlds. I managed to get an education from Joe Nye without ever having to get a grade from him. But I first met Sam Huntington not as a student. I was an intern at the New Republic. I think I was still an undergraduate, not at Harvard. And there was a peculiar campaign that was being waged by a Yale math professor named Serge Lang to deny Sam Huntington a seat in the National Academy of the Sciences. And I just was intrigued by the whole thing and took it up and went to interview him. And it was absolutely fascinating because he was more troubled by this than I would have ever imagined. Because the controversy was so obscure, it's difficult to fully give you the texture. Serge Lang would send me 1,500 page, I kid you not, files of the case against Sam Huntington. Basically, the brief synopsis is Sam was a hawk in general. And during the Vietnam War, he had written a bunch of things, including a long report for the government and a couple of articles in Foreign Affairs. And Serge Lang believed that this showed that he was effectively a war criminal and therefore should not be part of the National Academy of Sciences. In point of fact, while he was a hawk, on this particular issue, Sam was actually on the dovish side of the debate because he was arguing that the United States needed a much more political rather than military strategy in Vietnam. But Lang, almost in comprehending, it seemed as though there was almost some kind of strange bipolarity or something. He fixated on one page in which Sam Huntington described the effect of an American strategy which was herding people into cities, called it the strategic hamlets, and said he's advocating this policy. In fact, the next page he explains that this is a bad policy. So in any event, a very interesting thing for a 19 or 20-year-old kid to be trying to piece together. And listening to him, I remember vividly thinking to myself, God, this is so fascinating, because he was able to take these policy debates and frame them in a much broader theoretical context. I had been a history major, I was used to hearing people describe things in historical context and explain, this happened because of our history and things like that. Sam was able to put it all in a kind of theoretical context and explain to you, well, if this is the basic argument you're making, then this confirms it, that this falsifies it. And I didn't think much of it when the time came to apply to graduate schools, though I applied to PhD programs and luckily got into Harvard. And I think a couple of years later started working with him. So I think I'm going to just talk a little bit about what he meant, what I learned from him, because I would imagine for most of the people here who were students, the question is, why should you care about Sam Huntington? And why should you read his books? I think more than anything else, Sam Huntington represented the view that I think should be at the center of social science, and certainly was in his mind, that you must connect two large variables. That is to say that the purpose of social science is to shed some important light on important phenomena. So, if you think about it in social scientific terms, there is the cause and the effect, the independent and the dependent variable. And Sam would often say to me, you have to find a big independent variable and a big dependent variable. In other words, you've got to first start with something big that you're trying to explain. If you're trying to explain something trivial, who cares? So you try to explain the French Revolution. And then you have to have a powerful cause that explains it. If you have 19 things that explain the French Revolution, nobody cares. Because everyone knows that, He once said to me, if you tell people that the world is complicated, you're not doing your job as a social scientist. They already know it's complicated. Your job is to in some way distill it and simplify it and give them a sense of what is the single or a couple of powerful causes that explain this powerful phenomenon. And that's always stayed with me as the kind of central insight that Sam Huntington had for a student. I mean, in a time and in an academic profession where the instinct is for the capillary rather than the jugular, it's very important to remember that Sam always went for the jugular. And if you look at his books, they are really, it's sort of seriatim. He just goes through what are the biggest things in the world that need to be explained. And what do I think is the principal thing going on here? And he would do it with the post-colonial development of most of the world in political order and changing society. He does it with American politics when it seems to be spiraling out of control in the 1970s. He did it at the end of the Cold War with asking himself, what is the biggest thing happening here? And he saw it as the resurgence of ethnic and religious identity in particular, and so on. So I think whether you agree or disagree with any one of those, what is striking is how he never shied away from taking those kind of things on. Walter Lippmann once said, most people mumble because they are afraid of the sound of their own voices, meaning, you don't want to put yourself out there. When you put yourself out there, people will disagree with you. And Sam had his fair share of that. People disagreed with him vigorously. But I think that he was always able to try and shed some very powerful light on what was going on in the world. And he does it in so many different fields that it's extraordinary. To me, the central book of Sam Huntington's remains Political Order in Changing Societies, the book that really changed the way I look at the world. And if you ask yourself, why should you care about this book today? I would say it's very simple. If you are puzzling about the question of whether China will get more democratic as it gets richer, this is probably the central book to read. There are a couple of others you could, but the crucial question of whether or not, as societies modernize economically, they will also modernize politically, is at the heart of that book. And he takes you back in history, makes you understand why the United States has a very tough time understanding this question, and draws on Tocqueville. But at the end of the day, it's just a tour de force. Frank Fukuyama and I were talking about this one chapter in it about America's Tudor polity, which, I mean, it's amazing. I read the book when I was 22, 23 years old. I can still remember that chapter vividly. How many books can you say? Can you say that off when you're 46, in my case? And I think that the fact that he was able to take on a big subject like that and really change the terms of the debate. I mean, if you get into the arcana of modernization theory, it's an even more important book because of where it stands in it. But I think you can read it not knowing any of those intramural debates and still find it a very, very powerful kind of prism through which to understand that simple phenomenon. Is China going to become democratic as it becomes richer? I think that I'm going to tell you a few more things because I know that people like Frank and Elliott and Gideon will spend more time on his academic legacy in kind of more substantive terms. And since I'm the TV guy, I'll tell you a little bit. I'll give you a few more stories. There was also an extraordinary quality to Sam Huntington, which was he was a man of great character and very strong will and strong beliefs. I remember once reading some furious attack on him and asking him why he didn't respond. He said, well, Fareed, my view has always been, you put your best work out, you let people attack you, and then you move on. If you can spend your life getting caught up in letters to the editor and I didn't say this and I didn't say that, but it's pointless. The best thing you can do is write the next book, which will cause disagreements among people. And I thought that was such a fascinating way to look at what his role was as an intellectual and how he was able to, I mean, in many ways, like all of us, he was thin-skinned, but he was able to rise above it and act out as this sort of higher mission, this calling. He was also a man of great principle. It was not always principle that was popular and principle that people agreed with. I remember the small moment. He was chairing some administrative session at the Olin Institute, which he was the director of. And the administrative assistant pointed out there was a lot of pressure from the university that in the brochure that the Olin Institute puts out, there be something that said, we especially welcome and invite blacks and Hispanics to apply for these fellowships. And he thought this was going to be just a kind of matter of course, just throw it in and it'll be fine. And Sam said, I really can't go along with that. This person said, well, but the dean's office once said we kind of got to get this going. I've already drafted the language. And he said, I feel very awkward about making special invitations to people on the basis of their ascriptive qualities. So you'll have to tell the dean I won't do it. And this poor administrative assistant, prospect of having to explain this to the dean's office, was pushing back, and he said no. And then eventually they came up with a compromise, which was that they would say something like, we welcome people from every walk of life, some generic thing like that, but he would not. He said, I cannot do this. I cannot make a special invitation to somebody because of the color of their skin. I don't think that that's right. Now, as I say, you may agree with it or disagree with it, but there's a certain steel to his core that he simply would not compromise on when it was a trivial matter like that. He was also a great mentor and believed very much in the human dimension of mentoring. He was a genuine WASP in every sense of the word, and so I would say would not emote very readily. But there are very few professors who would invite vast numbers of their students up to their place on Martha's Vineyard, plan a whole day of fun and festivities. Nancy and he used to have us over for these things, and in many other ways represented, I think, some of the best aspects of Harvard, which is great intellectual standards, but also a very real emphasis on the human element of mentoring. So I think back on Sam Huntington first and foremost as one of the most towering intellects I have ever come across, but also as a great human being and a man of enormous character. And as I get older, I feel as though you learn a lot from books, but you also learn a lot from human beings and from the character of a man. Thank you.
Elliott.
Well, again, Graham, thank you for inviting me to be here. Nancy, so wonderful to see you. Many old teachers, and they're not old, former teachers, including people who taught me without knowing that they were teaching me. Dean Rosofsky, for example, and my friend Rick Hunt. At Sam's memorial service, I was under strict instructions from Nancy to be lighthearted, and so I was, or at least I tried to be. And tonight I find that harder to do for some reason. Maybe because she didn't give me an order. So forgive me, I'm going to be the straight man for my colleagues. Graham's instruction to us was to talk about two things. One was one aspect of Sam's intellectual legacy, and then something about the ways in which Sam was an inspiration. So let me just start with the legacy part. And in my field, which is military studies, strategic studies, clearly far and away the most important work is The Soldier and the State. Sam wrote a lot of other books. He wrote The Common Defense. He wrote some really sparkling essays about the nature of contemporary warfare. He wrote policy-relevant things about what then seemed a very large issue, the conventional balance in Central Europe. But I would say that the monument is The Soldier and the State. So The Soldier and the State is, in many ways, the foundational work of civil-military relations. As Frank and I were discussing before, I think we're all stealing your thunder, Frank. Of course, the interesting thing about Sam is his students all kind of tackled the things that he wrote, and he liked that. And so that goes for me, too, in this case. But it is a foundational book. And it's a staggering thing to think. He wrote it when he was, about 32. Published in 1957. That thing has been in print for over half a century. there aren't many books of which one can say that. And whether one likes it or doesn't like it, agrees with it or disagrees with it, you know, it's like the days before GPS. It's that known reference point that you navigate off of. I think what Sam was wrestling with in The Soldier and the State was, how does the United States, which now for the first time in its history has a large standing military in peacetime, manage that military? I think that is really at the core of what that book is about. That is the real world problem which animated his social science. And of course, for Sam, there were really big, large policy issues which would then drive him into scholarly work. And that's why he once coined the phrase policy-relevant basic research. As he said, that's what we do at the Olin Institute and at CFIA. I thought, what a marvelous phrase, policy-relevant basic research. Now, that's really what The Soldier and the State is. And Sam's thesis in this, in The Soldier and the State, is that the best way for democracies to control and appropriately manage their military organizations was by something he called objective control, which means maximizing military professionalism. Carving out a separate sphere for the military, and in a certain way, increasing its separation from society. This was quite controversial in its time, and I think it ended up temporarily affecting his job prospects, but that's a story for Nancy to share if she chooses. Because what Sam said is, you know, the military mind is a distinctive mind, military values are distinctive values, civilians should back off. And there's one passage at the end where Sam could get carried away, and he has this picture of the Sparta of West Point and the Babylon of Highland Falls, New York, the kind of scruffy little town outside West Point. I mean, Highland Falls in the mid-50s as Babylon somehow never really quite cut it. I mean, it was the 1950s, for goodness sakes. But I mean, it was a serious point, and it was, as Frida said, it was a courageous thing to say, because this ran counter to a lot of very deeply held American beliefs. And Sam was swimming against the tide in a number of ways, as he so often did. Part of what he was swimming against was the idea of the citizen soldier. And instead, you know, his heroes were the more austere, more narrowly military figures. So it's the argument of The Soldier and the State. I buy it only in part. I wrote a book partly explaining why I don't entirely buy it. But it stands as work, and it remains to this day relevant and important as we wrestle with, okay, so what exactly is the proper role of General Petraeus in formulating policy? Don't ask, don't tell. You know, to what extent should we make the military look like the rest of society? How fast? On what terms? All those issues are alive, and in addition to the fact that it's beautifully written, it's a book that I think challenges our assumptions and makes us think, even when we disagree with it. And that was very typical of Sam. So that's the intellectual, just one piece of the intellectual contribution. What about the inspirational part? Well, I'm a professor, so I'll talk about Sam as a professor. And if the undergraduates and the more senior folks here will forgive me, I want to particularly address the graduate students or people who think they may be graduate students and possibly pursue an academic career. I didn't learn teaching technique from Sam. Sam was a good lecturer. You know, was he the maestro of the podium? No. He ran a good seminar. Was he the greatest seminar leader that ever lived? I'm not sure. Was I most inspired by his brilliance? As brilliant he undoubtedly was? No, because brilliance is a gift, and either you have it or you don't. So there's not much you can do to inspire you. It can terrify you, and I would walk into Sam's office with my knees knocking because I knew who had been reading the chapters of my thesis. But that is not inspirational. His remarkable productivity, yeah, to some extent, but that's really a result of, that's a work ethic. And Sam had a fantastic work ethic. There are a lot of people who know how to work hard. I mean, it's like being smart, particularly in this place. There are plenty of people who can do that. What I would say Sam did for me was he taught me how to be a professor. And for the graduate students out there particularly, and I'm very glad these fellowships are for graduate students, that you'll think about what models you have. And the way in which Sam taught me to be a professor was, I think, in several respects. First, the way he dealt with students. And of course, you really can't separate him and Nancy from this one. I remember the hospitality and so on. But you shouldn't get the idea that Sam mollycoddled you. He didn't. What Sam knew how to do, and what many faculty members at many universities don't know how to do, is how, on the one hand, to challenge students without browbeating or bullying them, and how to support them without mollycoddling them. That is a very difficult balance to find, and somehow Sam always had that. Sam taught me to be a good citizen. When Dean Rosofsky, one of the great leaders of Harvard in the 20th century, asked him to do something, and I remember, because I'd be hanging around, Sam would just say yes. He would just say yes. There was no, are you going to give me some teaching relief? How much larger a salary are you going to give me? What else can I, maybe, I don't know, again, maybe Dean Rosofsky will have stories which will shatter my beliefs, but I don't quite think so. Sam was a good citizen, and I think in a time when loyalties to institutions of many kinds have attenuated, he's a model there. Sam was a bridge. In this respect, Sam is a model for somebody who is in political science. Sam was the bridge between the world of scholarship and the world of policy. His writings, as I said, were policy-relevant basic research. He made forays into Washington of various kinds, to include serving on the NSC staff. He knew what his roots were. His roots were in academe, and he was, first and foremost, a professor. But he made those two worlds speak to each other, and he had friends and colleagues, and he learned from people in both places. And in a period when, it frequently seems to me that a lot of political science has kind of drifted off into irrelevance, and a lot of policy wonkery is superficial, that's really something that we miss. And I would also say that Sam was a bridge too, in that Sam, by example, taught you that it's okay to have strong political opinions without ramming them down your students' throats, and it's a good thing to be a patriot. He's the only guy who ever hosted a party on Flag Day, which I never quite understood, but Sam was a patriot, and he believed in that. And finally, Sam had guts, and Fareed has talked about that. Many of the views he staked out were unpopular, and they were unpopular in the ways that matter. That is to say, unpopular with the people immediately around him. It's easy to write a defiant op-ed that might irritate the administration of the day. In fact, it's fun, I can tell you. It's another thing which will make your colleagues really angry at you, the groups of people that you really care about. And Sam had guts that way. He also had physical guts. We all cheered when he decked a mugger on Brattle Street. I think when he was about 70 years old. It was really, the Sons of Sam, as we called ourselves, were delighted when we heard that one. The last thing that I'll say is this. To sum it all up, and at the risk of getting maudlin, when you have experience of other walks of life, and you get a look at them, and I've spent most of my time hanging around with the military, with the intelligence community, to some extent serving in government, there's a lot about the academic world which doesn't look all that appealing. There's a lot of it that can look petty and self-referential and superficial and smug and irrelevant, and worst of all, inconsequential. And the great thing about being exposed to Sam Huntington was, without in any way qualifying those judgments, that he also showed you that it was something, could be something that was noble and worthwhile and ultimately deeply consequential. And for that, I'm forever grateful.
Frank.
Well, thank you very much, Graham, for inviting me to share some remembrances of Sam in this with this great audience. I met Sam towards the end of my days as a graduate student in the government department. He had been working in the Carter administration and came back to Harvard at the end of that period. My main memory from back then was my great fear of getting stuck on a one-on-one conversation with him at a reception because Sam was not the greatest person at making chit-chat in these events. And when you're a 24-year-old graduate student, talking at a party like this, and you try to fill this great silence, between you and a great professor, you're going to say something stupid. And so all I remember is that kind of experience. But I must say that Sam has actually taken over my life over the last 5 years. And it happened in this very incestuous way. Nobody's mentioned the fact that I guess all of us participated in these meetings on Cape Cod at the Guiano Club. So among other things, every summer, all of his former graduate students would gather for several days of just seminars and discussions and so forth. So the way this happened was Fareed Zakaria, when he had Gideon's old job as the deputy editor of Foreign Affairs, asked me to be a book review editor. And on the 75th anniversary of Foreign Affairs, we were all supposed to name the 5 most important books of the previous 75 years. And one of the books I listed was Political Order in Changing Societies. So just shows you how we're all part of a little clique here, elite clique that's running the country. It's behind everyone's back.
I thought they expelled you from that clique.
Yeah, well, that's...
I did.
Yeah. But I imagine as a result of my nominating that book, Sam was gracious enough when Political Order had gone out of print and Yale University Press wanted to republish it. And so when they did that new reprint edition, he asked me to write a foreword to it, which I was completely delighted to do because I use it in my teaching all the time. I really do think it's one of the great books in comparative politics. But as I started thinking about it, and I wrote the new foreword, and as I started thinking about it, I said, well, this book was written in 1968. It was only about a decade after the first big wave of decolonization. It talked about the prevalence of disorder in the developing world, but actually so much had changed. In fact, the first page of that book says, the Soviet Union and the United States are equally developed societies, politically developed societies, and here the Soviet Union had disappeared, Asia had risen, there's actually a great deal of stability, so I said to myself, well, this is a book that really needs to be extended and updated. And as I started thinking about how you would do this, I said, okay, well, we need to go back to basics and talk about the origins of politics. And so that's been my project for the last several years. I'm in the middle of a 2-volume book whose title is The Origins of Political Order. It's dedicated to Sam. And I think it draws on what I think is the central insight of that book, which Fareed has already pointed to, which is the view that politics or rather that the different dimensions of development, and especially political development, are separate from each other. They're not part of a huge interrelated modernization process. Modernization theory, which had been, Talcott Parsons and Harvard and MIT, this was the dominant school in the 1950s and early 60s, basically held that all good things go together. Economic growth, democracy, growth of individualism, liberation of individuals, all of these things were mutually supportive and mutually reinforcing. And along came Sam. Actually, this started out as an article called Political Order and Political Decay. And he said, no, they're actually not the same process, that you can have one without the other. You can have political development without economic growth and vice versa. And probably the most famous insight from that book was the idea that if socioeconomic development outruns the growth of political institutions, what you're going to have is political decay and political breakdown. And therefore, all good things did not go together, and that is the reason that he stressed the need for order before the other good things, because order would bring economic growth, and then possibly democracy, possibly other things. The most elegant recent restatement of this broad theme was written by my fellow panelist, two people down, Zakaria, who argued, in fact, that democracy and liberal rule of law and development ought to be sequenced, which is an insight that comes directly out of Sam's authoritarian transition. And so in my effort to rethink this whole set of problems, I begin with this insight. Political development is not necessarily related to all of the other components of development. You have to understand its own logic and how it then can interact with these other dimensions. I want to say something about the last three books that he wrote, which is The Third Wave, The Clash of Civilizations, and Who Are We, the book on American identity, because those were the last two especially, and especially the last one, were quite controversial. I actually think that they're probably his most important, in a way, challenge. This may seem surprising, but I actually think they're all the same book. The first one, The Third Wave, was about the surprising resurgence of democracy that took place after the democratic transitions in Spain and Portugal in the mid-1970s, culminating in the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Clash of Civilizations, I think you're all familiar with, about the resurgence of religion and ethnicity as dividing lines in the world. And then finally, the last one on the United States and our identity. The reason I think they're all the same book is that the same underlying factor is present in all of them, which is culture as an explanation for the growth of certain kinds of institutions. In The Third Wave, he did not say that the rise of democracy in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was due to its universal appeal. He said it comes out of a specifically Western Christian cultural milieu. There's no reason to expect that it should arise in other cultural contexts in the Middle East, in the Far East, and elsewhere. And therefore, the apparent universalism was simply a reflection of the power of the United States and its appeal, but it really was not a cultural universal. Clash of Civilizations, of course, was about a world organized according to large cultural units. And his last book, on American identity, the first half of it, I think, is absolutely incontrovertible. That if you ask who Americans are, one nice, safe answer is to say, well, it's the Constitution, it's the rule of law, it's all of our formal, visible political institutions. But Sam said, no, I'm sorry, it's those, but there's also what he called Anglo-Protestant culture. There is a religious and a specific cultural matrix in which specifically American virtues could arise. In fact, he's got this nice line that's on page 16 of the book, which he says, if the United States, if North America had been settled by French Catholics or Portuguese or Spaniards, would it be the United States that we know today? No, it would not. It would be Quebec, Brazil, or Mexico, because it's actually that cultural matrix that is critical. Now, I believe that this is one of the biggest challenges, in a sense, or gauntlets that's been thrown out there, which is the question whether our American liberal democratic institutions and values are universal, or whether they are actually byproducts of a peculiar Western, North American pattern of development. As Fareed suggested, it makes a huge amount of difference in thinking about the future of China or Iran or many other countries. I mean, I'm on record being on the universalist side, but I will admit that as time goes on, there's a lot of empirical evidence that could challenge that view, and I think it's not a resolved question. It's absolutely not a resolved question. We're going to have to come back, Graham, in another decade or two and see whether Sam was really right about this.
Thank you, Frank, and I think actually that just echoes right through already the three. Gideon.
Let me start by saying I don't buy what you just said. which would please Sam because he always liked it when you fought with him, and he always liked it when his students fought with each other. And in fact, there are no greater divisions in our field than those among Sam's students, which makes the gatherings of the students these days rather interesting. I'm not entirely sure about the idea that the last two books were of a piece with Third Wave. I need to think about that more, and my gut sense is I'm also not sure that he was right about the anti-universalist stuff. I'm on your side on that rather than his. So I tend more to be one of those types, like many of us, who sort of overlook the last two books rather than see them as part of the overarching that we like to celebrate. Let me reverse Eliot's order and start with the personal first and then go to the intellectual. Sam was one of the least Jewish people I've ever met in my life. And yet, the thing that comes to mind when I think of him to say is that he was a true mensch. And he was a person of great character. He was an incredibly decent guy. You're talking about a guy who was, in my opinion, and that of many others, without question, the greatest social scientist of the second half of the 20th century, bar none, period. And yet, a more non-diva-ish person, a less diva-ish person than Sam, could not be imagined. This was a person who had every right to be an extraordinary diva, and yet was not, was humble, not humble. He knew how good he was, but he acted humble. He was decent. When I was heading up the Olin Institute's seminar series, the graduate series, and we could invite any professor, I said, Sam, as well as the graduate students and the fellows, I said, Sam, this was right when Clash was still an occasional paper before it had become an article and book and so forth. And it was circulating, and very few of us agreed with it. And I said, Sam, I'd like you to start off the seminar series and present Clash. And he said, I'm not even going to try the imitation. There are others who do a much better Sam imitation than I am, so I'm not going to try. He said, well, sure, but can't you get somebody else? You don't feel like you have to invite me just because I'm the head of the institute. And I said, no, I really want you because I want you to set the tone because, Clash, it's a paper, it's going to get a lot of criticism, we'll go at it, and people will see, the graduate students and the other people of the seminar will see that you can actually take on, the head of the institute and he will accept it and that will set the right tone. And so he was quiet for a second and looked at me and said, you want me to do it so that I'll be criticized, so that people will yell at me, and that's why you want me to be the thing? And I was like, basically, yeah, because you'll say, and he was like, okay. And that was sort of Sam, the idea that actually you could even have that conversation with him, with this guy who we all thought was the greatest thing since sliced bread. The idea that you could say, gee, this is a very controversial work, but I want you to have the kind of discussion there that we would fight about. He was a deeply shy person, and some of his awkwardness in person seemed a bit standoffish, but it was actually shyness. And when you knew that, you wouldn't mind being stuck as much at a party with him or in a small conversation with him because you knew that it wasn't about you. The normal tendency was to assume that the conversation wasn't going well because there was something wrong with you or because he didn't think well of you. In fact, it was somewhat sort of about him. And he had a way of putting you at ease and was incredibly nice and encouraging to people well beneath him in a way that, again, cannot possibly be imagined for somebody of that stature. But these are all things about Sam the man, why we loved him as a person and as a professor. But let me conclude by going back to the thing that Graham said in the beginning, which is, okay, well, why should somebody other than his relatives and his friends and people who are getting a fellowship in his name need to care about this guy? And the short answer there is that it's not just because he was a great guy. It's not just because he was a wonderful teacher. It's not just because he was a sort of a good interlocutor in debates in his day. It's that he was so damn smart, and he was so damn original, and he was so serious-minded, and he was so honest, that with all those things put together, he created works that made huge and enduring contributions to several different important fields of knowledge, to the point where you cannot be considered an educated person in political science or social science more generally if you are not familiar with the Huntington oeuvre. And in fact, you probably cannot understand certain kinds of subject matters unless you grapple with Sam Huntington's work. whether you agree or disagree. And that goes for several different areas. The single best piece of work I know on what conservatism is, on how to think about something as basic a concept as conservatism, is Sam's APSR article from the late 1950s on the subject. If you want to understand American politics and why we go through these various paroxysms of beating ourselves over the head for not living up to our ideals, a recurrent theme of American foreign policy, you cannot find a better place to understand that than American politics, The Promise of Disharmony. Okay? The concluding paragraphs of the concluding lines of that book are as good as, if not better than, in terms of writing, than the end of Soldier in the State, and far more actually valid. You know, he concludes that book by saying, America is always a disappointment, but it's only a disappointment because it is also always a hope. And that the tension between ideals and practices and institutions, absolutely central to American politics. Political order. My wife, who is the smarter one in the family and is a professor at Barnard, has spent basically 2/3 of her publications in her career simply reselling political order because the basic argument about institutions and the importance of institutions is so dominant in so many areas, but yet so not fully understood by people who should, that you can repeat it and basically point out other people are idiotic and wrong and need to understand Huntington in order to do it. I gave the political order to a brilliant young staffer of mine because he'd heard me talk about it so much. I said, go read that. And he came back from a discussion from being in Venezuela and said, my God, now I understand what he was talking about. I now understand what's going on in Venezuelan politics that I couldn't have understood before this. The works that Sam left behind not only are the shaped fields like Soldier in the State and Civil Society and Civil Military Relations, but continue to actually be required reading lists. I think that in a well-ordered discipline of political science, the syllabi today in current courses would be full of Sam Huntington's work. And that is why, in addition to being a nice guy that his family and his students value and remember and pay homage to, that is why people who never knew him and aren't going to know him can still benefit from engaging with the work that he put out there.
Thank you very much. This is a terrific panel, and I think you've each should have hit a number of high points in a career that included so many works that we're obviously not doing justice to any of them, but there are a dozen central questions, any one of which we could debate for a very long time, and much of the work that we do will end up debating these. Let me see, as among the panel, so Frank raised certainly one of the most engaging questions, which is the universal modernization, all good things go together view, which I would say remains the 80% view of policy and elite opinion, and which was also your view, Frank's view, in his End of History, but which you've come to have second thoughts about, if I got the point. So tell us just a line or two of the Huntington argument for the other side, and then let's see where any of the members disagree. And then right after that, I'm going to invite questions from the audience where there are microphones both on the ground floor and up here. But Frank, give us the capsule of the argument, and then I would like to see where people disagree. Since you're disagreeing, you're agreeing with Sam and disagreeing with Frank, if I got it, in your current view, yes?
Well, okay. First of all, let me just explain. I think the central issue, and the reason why I think that the third wave on democracy actually was very consistent with the last two books, was that its argument was you look at all the countries that have democratized in the third wave, the overwhelming majority of them are Christian, and in fact they're Catholic. In Latin America, Spain and Portugal and so forth. And he said that this is simply kind of the logic of a Western civilization that had these cultural values, transmitted them. The Catholics were just the last ones to get on board this train, but they were fundamentally different from the values held in in other parts of the world. And so it wasn't a universal phenomenon. Now, I think that this is something that we can really debate because, democracy's taken root in Korea, in Taiwan, in Japan, in Indonesia, in other parts of Asia, which in Huntington's view are a distinct civilization, more hierarchical, more deferent to authority. And so I actually, on that score, believe that there is something about the functional purpose of democracy, which is to hold rulers accountable, that makes it a universally desirable kind of political institution. And I happen to believe that the Chinese are going to figure this out down the road. They're not going to solve their problems by this top-down command system where there's only upward accountability. But as I said, I don't think that, but that's something absolutely that, that we can debate right now, because I don't think the results are in on this.
Fareed? Yeah.
I think Frank puts it exactly right. It would seem to me, I myself, in my book, am closer to the crude theory of modernization than Huntington's sophisticated dissent. That is to say, I basically believe, as Frank was saying, China will become more democratic as it gets richer. And I think that the powerful evidence of Asian modernization would suggest that it is not culturally specific. But I think that Sam's real argument, which I think is very powerful, and it's probably the most important emendation or kind of sophisticated variation on modernization, is it's not just about getting richer. It's not just about per capita GDP. It is, as Frank said, about the nature of institutions and political institutions in particular, and the ability of those political institutions to continue to develop, to deal with he called it social mobilization, to deal with the increasing degree to which society, people get more educated, participate more in the system and things like that. So I think that I would agree with Frank's basic argument, and I make that case in The Future of Freedom. But I think the thing I would look at, the variable I would look at when trying to figure out whether or not China was going to go through a relatively harmonious process here is the Communist Party of China. That is the institutional structure of Chinese politics and Chinese government, and not purely per capita GDP. And that is very much a Huntingtonian insight. Gideon mentioned his wife. She wrote an article in Foreign Affairs recently. It got through the elaborate peer review system that Foreign Affairs has.
Like you're
in
asking
which,
Sam to review
yeah,
Sam's book?
in which she never would have happened in my day. In which she points out, it's a very smart essay in which she points out that if you're trying to understand what is happening in Afghanistan, Afghanistan is going through a process of slow modernization, very much like Europe in the Middle Ages. And so if you're trying to figure out whether the warlords in Afghanistan are going to cede power to Mr. Karzai, ask yourself whether the barons in France ceded power to Louis XV, because it was exactly the same process. And that focus on institutional structure is the core Huntingtonian insight. And I do believe it's valid today, even as I say, as somebody who believes in a slightly cruder version of modernization theory.
Let me pick you back on that for a second. When Clash came out and Sam gave a talk on it at the Council on Foreign Relations, I was newly ensconced as a fellow there, and I knew that Sam likes to get into it, and he loves nothing more than to be actually challenged. And so I asked a question at one point, and I said, Sam, everyone's lauding your new book in which you talk about the role of importance of culture. In political order, you talked about the crucial difference between statelessness and state strength. And in Third Wave, you talked about the nature of nature of political institutions, the regime type. So I'm curious, are you now saying that culture is more important than the existence of a state or not? Is it more important than the nature of a regime type, or is it simply something that after you've accounted for the existence of a state and the nature of a regime, then you bring in cultural variables to explain some of the residual? How does this relate to previous works? And Sam laughed, and he said, that's the kind of question we teach him to ask at Harvard. But I think that one of the things to think about is that he wasn't always talking in these books about the exact same question. So and I think you can layer on these things. And I would be in this case with Fareed. Sam was very upset with the canceling of the elections in in Algeria because he felt that it was incredibly inappropriate just because out of fears that it would go the wrong way to stop the democratic process along the way. And he was totally open to the idea that you could have universal norms and modern liberal things in places that didn't start out necessarily being that way. This was the opposite of a nativist. And so my problem with some of the later stuff is that just because something began in a certain way doesn't mean it's not able to be open to everybody. British institutions started in Britain, they came over here and they're open to everybody, and so in the same way, some of the models that. So I think that the universalist stuff is fully in keeping with much of the Huntingtonian tradition. And in the long run, it will play out the way he said. It's just not necessarily going to happen in a lockstep or simple or easy way.
So Elliott, you can agree or disagree, but then I'm inviting the audience to stand up at the microphones. There are 2 on the ground floor and 2 in the loges, and we'll let you put a question. But Elliott gets the last comment on this.
I mean, it's not my field, but that's never stopped me before. And I think, I basically agree with Frank, although to some extent it seems to me that this debate becomes almost a little bit definitional. I mean, yes, all good things to go together, but maybe there can be these really long lags. So China eventually does democratize, and maybe you have politically very developed countries that take a little while to take off economically. The larger issue, though, and it's unfortunately, I think it's only now I would have the guts to have this conversation with Sam, is really confronting the fact that he is this great social scientist. He was not an historian. I mean, his works were historically rich. A Soldier in the State was historically rich, although historians would often quarrel with Sam a lot. And I often wondered, and I wonder when I listen to these discussions, how much room we're leaving for contingency, for the conjunction of different kinds of events. I mean, it's no accident that my next book is really just a piece of history, so you can tell which way I'm going. But I think it's a larger question to think about as we think about Sam's overall oeuvre. Does he underplay the role of personality, contingency, odd conjunctions in explaining different kinds of outcomes? And my inclination is probably to say yes.
Okay, let me go to the audience. Let me explain the ground rules. Please introduce yourself. Please make your question succinct, and please end with a question mark. And this gentleman is first.
My name is Nasser Fazal. I'm a former chemistry teacher from a local university. Actually, this is a request. About 20 years ago, I was a part of a debate here at Harvard. I wasn't involved in the debate, but I was witnessing the debate between Mr. Huntington and Professor Joseph Nye. I would like to request to Joseph Nye to say a few words about that debate. It was very unusual, very interesting debate, if it's possible.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Professor Nye, please. He was either in favor of it or against it, but.
I'll just echo briefly what the distinguished students have said. The nice thing about Sam is you could disagree with him profoundly on some things, and he took you seriously, and you remained friends. And I don't remember the details of the debate. I do remember that I did not agree with the Clash of Civilizations. I thought Sam was going against his own tradition of essentially as a realist, the structure of the state should have been crucial. And the idea that the structure of the state was now being replaced as the institutional basis for international politics struck me as wrong. I mean, I used to say, Sam, this is your insight, which is that culture is becoming more important in the aftermath of the Cold War, is absolutely right. But that it's the basis for all international conflicts, I don't see that. I mean, it's more like Freud's narcissism of small differences, Bosnians and Croats killing each other, or Northern Irish Catholic and Protestants killing each other. So I said, I really just don't buy this. But the interesting thing was not whether I was right or wrong. The interesting thing is that Sam and I could disagree on things like that. And afterwards, we remained very close friends. And of the colleagues that I've had and intellectual influences I've had, I think I learned as much from Sam as from anybody, even when I disagreed with him. So I think that was what I would recall about that debate.
Thank you, Joe. This lady on the left, please.
Yes, hi. My name is Laura Esquivel. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy Center. And I will try to be succinct, but I hope you'll indulge me a few extra seconds. There don't seem to be a long line of people waiting to ask questions. I think it's unfortunate, and I apologize, I'm reading this. I didn't have time to print out my question, but it's not that long. I think it's very unfortunate this panel wasn't organized to have a fulsome discussion about Huntington and his legacy. In my experience, and I imagine most of you would agree, it's impossible to have an intellectually rigorous discussion when the only discussants are students and admirers of the person being discussed. It feels more today like an academic eulogy and testament to the greatness of the person with very little attention being paid to the substance of his work, much less a critique of it. A question or two from the audience doesn't provide commensurate balance by any means, but I will do my best to at least raise the perspective of one of the legions of Huntington critics. For many people, including for many Americans like me, his, quote, legacy includes providing the intellectual foundation for virulent anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and anti-Mexican fervor in this country. In his book, Culture Matters, on page 183, Huntington states that one of the greatest threats to this country is that all non-European immigrants, and Mexican immigrants in particular, aren't adequately committed to America's Anglo-Protestant culture, the ethic of self-reliance, hard work, and moral uprightness. I don't know how many Mexican immigrants he knew, but I can't think of more hardworking people to come to this country. My question to each of you, as fervent admirers of Huntington, is do you agree with the premise underlying his anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican, anti-multicultural arguments, which assert the moral, cultural, and ethical superiority of Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, US-centric values? And if you do agree, how do you not find these kinds of sentiments divisive and harmful to the goal of social harmony in an increasingly diverse society, in spite of the people who would wish it weren't so?
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. I think it's one that Sam would enjoy. And let me see who would like Frank.
No, I'm happy to take that on. I guess the two parts of that of the last book of Who Are We, I quite agreed with the first part, and I quite disagreed with the second part for reasons very similar to Gideon's, which is I think there's no question that American identity is shaped by Anglo-Protestant values. I mean, historically, that's where our American identity came. They come out of a certain ethnic group. They come out of a certain religious confession. But the question then down the road is, as Gideon said, isn't there something actually open and universal about them? So, and I've said this in print, so if you ask, so Sam has a whole chapter on the Protestant work ethic, and so you say, well, who is it that works hard in the United States today? It's not all these coupon clipping, trust fund wasps. It's not the Scotch-Irish, impoverished Scotch-Irish in Appalachia. It's the Russian cab driver. It's the Korean grocery store owner. It's the Mexican day laborer. Those are the ones who have inherited, the mantle of those values. But I do think that he had a basic insight that those values were critical in shaping American identity. I think he's wrong. I do think that the power of that culture is strong, and its openness is such that, in fact, the country is able to assimilate these diverse groups. But it's not on the basis of a kind of doctrinaire multiculturalism where everybody simply does their own thing regardless of the deeper cultural traditions of the country. And there I think he was actually quite right.
Fareed, yeah.
Yeah, can I just add one thing? I agree with everything Frank said. I think that in a way it would have been more Huntingtonian of him to have asked where these values came from. Why was it that Northern Europe was shaped by these Protestant values? And you would discover that there's a process of historical development and institutional development, in some cases religious institutions, that produced this process. It was not, the DNA of Protestantism that somehow made people believe in delayed gratification. It had something to do with the time, place, and institutional structure of the places they came from. He therefore did emphasize a great deal the importance of assimilating to those values, which I do think is part of it. You know, there is a difference between Mexico and the United States. And part of that has to do with the cultural context in which the United States was founded, which emphasized certain values. The most controversial part about the book is the discussion of Mexico. And I want to say, well, basically, again, I agree with Frank. I think Sam got emotional. I mean, he's emotionally attached to this Anglo-Protestant culture and was therefore, I think, more willing to see it under attack than it really is from multiculturalism, in my view. The best WASPs, if you mean by WASPs, people who believe in hard work, delayed gratification, and personal responsibility these days are Korean Americans and Indian Americans. You know, and if you want to find Max Weber's Protestant Europe, you will find it in China and Korea, not in America anymore. They should be holding Thanksgiving. We should be celebrating Mardi Gras, really. But he did point out that there was something unusual and specific about Mexican immigration in the United States, which is true and which is very difficult to deny. When you look at the facts, and you look particularly at California and Texas, you know, you look at the vast majority of immigrants who are coming in are Mexican. Many of them are not coming in really for the traditional reason people come to the United States, which is to become Americans for a better life. They're looking for temporary work. They would really much prefer to be able to be seasonal workers who come back and forth. They get trapped because the borders are now closed.
I don't know anyone who would
And if
prefer
you
to
look
be a
at,
seasonal worker going back and forth.
you asked your question. If you'd like to hear my response, otherwise, you know, keep going.
No, please, we have some speakers and we have a question. We have other people with questions. So
If you look at the impact on, you know, in terms of the ability to learn English, the ability to assimilate, there is a disproportionate problem with Mexicans. Part of it is that they are able to go back to Mexico so easily. There is a movement back and forth. So I think it is fair to say that is something we should talk about honestly, and that Mexican immigration is really quite different from almost all other immigration, and that when people look at what is happening to California schools and things like that, I think that there is a real issue there. In my opinion, there was a golden opportunity to deal with it with the immigration reform bill, which dealt with this attempt to separate out people who were really coming here as immigrants and people who in fact wanted to be guest workers. Unfortunately, that all collapsed. So, but wherever you stand, and as I say, I basically disagree with him on the Mexican issue broadly writ. You can't deny that there is a very specific problem with Mexican immigration, which is different from that of other immigrants.
Nobody's answered my question yet. My question was, do you agree with his premise about the cultural superiority of the Protestant Anglo ethic? I mean, we all agree there are
we got the question. Elliott's going to give the answer, yes or no, okay? And how about we'll get Gideon, yes or no?
The first thing I was going to say was,
Please.
you know, Fareed Zakaria, Gideon Rose, Frank Fukuyama, Elliott Cohen, I don't detect any Anglo-Protestants here.
Wait, that's why I invited you. No, okay.
Maybe Allison, I don't know. But I mean, for sure, my grandparents were immigrants, and believe me, they were not Anglos and they weren't Protestants. Would I have phrased it the way he did? Absolutely not. And I also think that it is fair to say that most of us, as we become older, become more pessimistic, and I think that may have happened to Sam to some extent. I think that is I suspect a younger Sam would have been a more optimistic Sam, and although I take Fareed's point, you know, the question of absorbing immigrants is always a serious one. I also think, and this gets to my point earlier about history, that historians of the United States would paint a considerably more nuanced picture of how our beliefs evolved. Among other things, they would point out we were not just settled by Anglo-Protestants. Even at the time of the Revolution, about 40% of the population were all kinds of other folks, including Catholics and whatnot. But I guess I do think, and in this you're probably correct, that you are picking up a group of 4 people who agree, well, I'll just speak for myself. I mean, I agree with Sam that there is something distinctive about the United States, and there's a kind of distinctive creed. Where it comes from is complicated. But I do know that I've taken my students, as I frequently do, to Gettysburg, and I see the kid who was born in Guatemala and moved here when he was 12 years old, or the kid who was born in Korea and moved here when they were, 10, get choked up at the end of the day when somebody reads the Gettysburg Address. And they're getting choked up because they own a piece of Lincoln. That's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. There aren't many other countries like that, if any. I mean, I get choked up, and I'm getting choked up not just because I think Lincoln was a great man, but because somehow this belongs to me, even though at the time that the Gettysburg Address was delivered, my great-great-grandparents were dodging Cossacks. So I don't think we'd put it the way that Sam put it, but I think the sentiment is one that at least I can share.
I guess I just say very simply on that, which is, again, first of all of us who are here, as Elliott said, Sam Huntington didn't have a bigoted bone in his body, and his personal interactions displayed that, and I think his work displays that. I wasn't a big fan of some of the later books, precisely for the reasons we're talking about now. I believe in the multicultural, in the dominance of the culture that he was talking about. I'm not a multiculturalist, and I'm damn proud and pleased that my ancestors had the good sense to come to a place where their descendants could partake of the benefits of the nice Anglo-Protestant culture and institutions that their Jewish and Eastern European forebears didn't actually have. So the whole genius of the United States is precisely that it universalized a set of traditions and a set of patterns that everybody else could come into. So I think you can be an American cultural superiorist or whatever, but while still thinking it's open to anybody who wants to come, and that's its genius. I think that but you know what? I read an interview with Warren Buffett recently, and he said that if you have 100% of your charitable initiatives, if you're a philanthropist, succeeding, then you're being way too safe, because you can't. That means that your selection criteria are not risk acceptant enough. And I think that's a little bit the way I feel. That's what I would say about Sam with his ideas, which is Sam took interesting, original, difficult challenges in his intellectual work, some of which basically I disagreed with and other people disagreed with. And if we sat here and basically were celebrating someone whose every single piece of writing that we could agree with, then that would be a safe, timid scholar who stayed within the bounds of conventional wisdom on basically everything he wrote about. And you're talking about a genius, a Promethean scholar who made many, many more great contributions than his few things that I happen to disagree with. And somebody else might think the things that I think are great aren't, and vice versa. Even Homer nods. That doesn't make him not Homer.
Let me go to this gentleman for the last question, and then we're going to have to clear out because Noella is saying, cut, the next scene comes. So you get the last question, please.
Thank you. My name is Usman Javed, and I'm a public policy student at the Kennedy School. My question is particularly targeted to Mr. Zakaria. When you were talking about Mr. Huntington's ways, you said that one great thing about him was he solved big problems, asking big questions, big solutions. One issue that I see with that is most often big problems have micro-level causes, a function of many micro-level causes. When you talked about democracy in Afghanistan, comparing it within a historical context to Europe, it's warlords in Afghanistan, it's feudals and spiritual leaders in my home country of Pakistan. So my question would be, how would you temper the big insights you would get from a historical analysis with this micro-level understanding of cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, and society in general within these different geographic areas?
That is, in a sense, the crucial question about social science. It's a wonderful question, which is how do you, I think it was Eliot who said historians often criticized Sam Huntington. Well, historians criticize all social scientists. And by the way, historians generally criticize historians like Eric Hobsbawm or Paul Kennedy. That is, anyone who makes grand generalizations on the basis of history is by definition obscuring the reality. The reality is always more complex. And that's what I think Sam meant when he said, if you're just telling people that the origins of Pakistani democracy are complicated, well, they already know that. Mm-hmm. You know, the question is what caused Pakistan to fail as a democracy, or what caused it, and is there something you can say? So I think that the way I look at it, I leave it to the historians to describe in rich and loving detail the texture of these societies and this historical development. They gather all these note cards, and God knows they have to then use them. And that is why you get the 900-page biography on some obscure Civil War general, because it's all, we've gotten it all and we're going to inflict it all on the reader. I think that
It's a little bit more complicated.
what sheds, you can see
Elliott's
that,
book is now 800 pages long, so you're getting close.
what I think sheds light on the world is to take, William James called this, I think, the Blumen Buzzin confusion of life, to take that and to find some pattern, to find some order, and to say, yes, Afghanistan is very different, it has all these different, but here's one very crucial similarity, which is the degree to which the regions were able to be independent of the central government because of their sources of revenue. And that crucial issue, when that died out, they had to depend on the central government for revenue, and that transformed the relations in France in the 16th century, and it is beginning to transform relations in Afghanistan. So you're looking for something like that, because otherwise, you're looking at history and it's just cycles of Cathay. It's just, everything goes on one thing after the other. You're trying to draw some insight from it. Now, I will be completely frank. That is very much the perspective of a social scientist. I view historians as my research assistants. I'm very glad they're doing all that work. Somebody needs to do it. But then you step back and say, okay, but what does it all mean? What caused what? And so you will decide what your own temper is, in a sense. If you are more interested in the contingent elements of life, you'll spend much more time on them. McGeorge Bundy, I think it's in David Halberstam's book, talks about, it's in Graham Allison's book, I think, quoting McGeorge Bundy, but there's a line about Vietnam, and the line goes, Pleikus are like streetcars. You find one when you need one. Pleiku was an incident that took place that allowed the United States to get more involved in Vietnam. And what Bundy was saying was, look, we were structurally geared to get more involved in Vietnam. Pleiku was the cab. When we needed it, we put a hand up, and that was the one that showed up. I'm caricaturing. That's my basic view of the contingent forces of history. They're all real, but why do they happen at that moment? Why is it that society happens to take them on? And this, as I say, is very much the perspective of a Huntingtonian.
Unfortunately, we haven't come to conclusions on all the topics raised tonight, but we've come to the end. For a splendid panel that I hope interested you again in going back and reading Sam's books, and I think a very authentic portrayal of the degree to which even Sam's books disagree with themselves from time to time, and this group clearly disagrees with some things and agrees with others. Let's say thank you very much. And I need to encourage you not to linger, because you need to get out so that other people can come in, and the door is over here. So the forum staff is saying, please leave quickly.
Where was that? Was that in?
Yeah, that's in, it's a Bundy quote, though. Yeah, I think it.